Good morning. My name is Yang Kwan, and I'm the Director of Communications at the Korea Economic Institute. South Korea's soft power has grown noticeably in recent years. In addition to the success of cultural exports like K-pop, Korea went from a country that was being referred to occasionally for its good public policy, such as President Obama's reference to its educational system, to a country that was invited to participate in the 2021 G7 summit as an observer. Many factors likely contributed to this elevation in Korea's global status, including its role in shaping the G20 amid the 2008 global financial crisis. But COVID-19 appears to have most recently catalyzed this transformation. Our guest today has written a working paper for KEI's academic paper series on how Korea advanced its image in the wake of its success in combating the initial outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. He's here with us today to share with us his findings and thoughts on what this might say about Korea's future role on the global stage, and perhaps what this means for actors like the United States and China. You can find this paper at keia.org. And our guest today is Kadir Ayhan. He's an assistant professor of international relations at Ewha Women's University Graduate School of International Studies. He serves as editor-in-chief of Journal of Public Diplomacy and regularly consults for governmental public diplomacy projects in Korea. Dr. Ayhan's works have appeared in peer-reviewed journals such as International Studies Perspectives, Korea Observer, Asia Pacific Education Review, and Asian International Studies Review, among others. Welcome, glad to have you with us here today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
He will present a 30-minute overview of his research, followed by a discussion and a Q&A. I invite audiences watching on YouTube to submit questions on the platform. With that, Dr. Ayhan, over to you.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm happy to be in Washington at KEI, and I'm looking forward to a lively discussion today. Maybe we can begin the slides. So today I'll be talking mainly about Korea's public diplomacy initiatives related to COVID-19, and I'll be talking about it in line with the country's global status seeking initiatives related to also the country's foreign policy goals. I'll begin first with a background, the background against which Korea seeks global status, higher global status, and also against which it does its public diplomacy, COVID-19 related public diplomacy. And then I'll move to the trends related to Korea's COVID-19 humanitarian aid, as well as how it has been doing or what it has been doing on the digital platforms for its public diplomacy. And then I'll move to more kind of speculative discussion and conclude the presentation there. And I'll be looking forward to the Q&A because, as you have mentioned, this is a working paper. So I hope we'll have some lively discussion, which will help me build on this research. So Korea is one of the first hardest hit countries with COVID-19. If you remember, late February, Korea was one of the top countries with the highest number of COVID-19 cases. But then it was very sudden, very quick to flatten the curve, to the extent that there were zero cases at some point, zero domestic cases. I think it's April. So within only 2 months, it was able to eliminate COVID-19 altogether. So it was a huge success in that sense. And Korea didn't stop there. So as early as March, Korea began sharing its flattening the curve experience with other countries. So it was kind of a tragic event going on, but at the same time, an opportune moment to showcase that Korea has capabilities-based authority in global governance, and Korea tried to utilize it by sharing its know-how and expertise with other countries, and by showcasing that it's capable to do so. It's capable to manage the crisis quite successfully compared to other countries. So within just less than a month, from being one of the hardest hit countries to become uh, one of the countries that shares its know-how. So with that, Korea published a few very long reports in foreign languages, mainly in English, and published them online so that anybody who would want could just go online and read these reports. This is mainly targeting other countries, policymakers, to learn from Korea's know-how. Flattening the Curve on COVID-19 is one of those reports. All About Korea's Response to COVID-19 is another governmental report to that. And there are many others on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website. And there are also some videos, some seminars, webinars that Korea shared its experiences with. Some of these are public, some of these are more customized to, tailored to the policymakers, so that they had meetings, webinars targeting these policymakers in other countries. And to leave COVID-19 aside for a minute, to give some background about Korea's global status seeking, as you mentioned before, Korea today is one of the top countries in terms of most important political and foreign policy related indices, but it wasn't one in the past. So right after the Korean War, it was at the bottom in almost all important indices in terms of military, in terms of economy, in terms of diplomatic representation, in terms of voice, global voice. It was at the bottom of this global status hierarchy, but it is not that Korea anymore. Today, Korea is number 6 in terms of global firepower index, which is kind of a proxy for the country's military. It is number 10th in terms of nominal GDP, again, an important indicator for its strong economy. It's number 13th in terms of its global diplomatic networks. So the country, of course, South Korea wants to be recognized for having a higher status in the global status hierarchy. And for many years, many administrations were not happy with how Korea is recognized globally. Rightly so, because although the country is in the top 10 in most indices, the recognition is a little bit late. It's not recognized as much globally. So there has been so much effort to change this, especially under Im Yong-bak government. It was probably the most assertive in terms of pronouncing this kind of gap between how the Korea ranks in the world and how it is recognized. But of course, this has been an accumulative effort since Park Chung-hee until Moon Jae-in administration. All administrations have cared about this. And indeed, Park Chung-hee has been talking about searching for a higher status for Korea among advanced nations. And you can find similar quotes by almost all presidents since then. And indeed, if you dig deeper, you can even find Lee Seung-man talking about similar things. Indeed, under Chon Do-han administration, for example, one of the ideas was that to achieve a higher global status, we need to engage in omnidirectional diplomacy, meaning that we need to go beyond the Korean Peninsula. We need to go beyond our diplomatic relations with the US and Japan. And under Roh Tae-woo government, of course, there was an opening to North Korea, Russia, China, and other former socialist countries, or currently socialist countries. And today, after of course, other presidents, it's been even more important to engage with the world beyond Korean Peninsula. And one of the ways to do so is to engage in providing global public goods, to engage in more multilateral diplomacy, and also engage in international aid Korea becoming one of the countries to be a donor, graduating from being a recipient, an ODA recipient. Traditionally, global status, when we talk about global status, traditionally its markers, its status markers have been material resources, especially military and economy. But more recently, it's been more important that if you provide for global public goods, then you can earn some recognition through this way as well. And the traditional middle power countries such as Australia, Canada, Sweden, they've been doing this very well. They've been capitalizing on this despite having less material resources compared to other richer countries. They've been punching above their weight in Barack Obama's words. And Korea has been trying to benchmark these countries. And this is especially important in the current transforming world order, in the sense that Amitav Acharya suggests that this is a multiplex world order in which issue areas are more important than talking about world politics or world order in terms of polarity of strong militaries. So in the Cold War era, we had the Soviet Union and the US as two strong military powers. But today, we talk about specific issue areas: global health governance, global environmental governance, global financial governance. So who are the authorities in these issue areas? Sometimes we see the big militaries, military powers coinciding also to be the big authorities in these issue areas, but also some middle or small powers finding their voice and authority within these issue areas. And sometimes transnational actors, such as, for example, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, being a hugely important authority in global health governance, for example, or Gavi Alliance, for example. So Korea, I think, has realized this, and Korea also is trying to take advantage of this, and rather than, and indeed it has a very strong military, but proverbially it's been suggested that Korea is like a shrimp among the whales. So despite Korea ranks, let's say, number 6 in terms of military, number 10 in terms of nominal GDP, and in the top 10 in most indices, it still ranks number 5th in most indices within the region. Because if we consider Russia and the US to be in this region, it's still behind US, China, Russia, and Japan in most of these indices. So Korea cannot really compete for regional leadership, regional status, because status is hierarchical. In that sense, Korea cannot really compete with these countries, but instead, Korea can change the competition platform from regional to global, because globally there is more diffuse element to global status hierarchy, and Korea ranks among the top. Korea has a voice there, and there, rather than, I mean, military and economy is still important status markers, but going beyond that, contributions to global governance issue areas has also become very important status markers in this transforming world order, as I suggested. And Korea is benchmarking these traditional middle powers and trying to contribute as much as it can to be recognized as a globally important higher status country. So this is the background against which Korea has been doing public diplomacy during COVID-19. COVID-19 did not actually bring so much change for Korea's public diplomacy, for Korea's international contributions, but it only catalyzed it. And again, here I took some screenshots from Korea's diplomatic white papers in English and in Korean. Almost every year, it's the 5th chapter, which talks about Korea's status in line with Korea's international contributions. So how the country has been contributing to global governance issue areas, and how it is supposed to help the country to achieve a higher global status in the hierarchy, in the status hierarchy. So Korea has been making this connection. So it's not me as a scholar that's making this connection, but it's the government that's been making this connection between its international contributions and its international status. Indeed, public diplomacy is also discussed in this chapter 5 in diplomatic white papers, which is published every year. And most recently, President Moon Jae-in, when he met with the Korean public in a town hall meeting, he suggested that if the G10, this is my translation, if the G10 was to be constructed, Korea would be the first country to qualify for it. And he made the connection with how Korea successfully managed the pandemic and how it helped Korea to be recognized, to rank among these top 10 countries. Of course, also accepting that this is not just his government's effort, this is not just COVID-19, but it's been an accumulative effort for many administrations now. Korea Foundation President Lee Gan also recently suggested in an article that Korea is showcasing a new model, an open and liberal model of pandemic management or crisis management, not limited to pandemics. And this kind of model or this kind of success helps Korea to become one of the new advanced great powers. So this has been suggested in Korea. This has been among the official talk, really, making this connection between how the country does in global governance platforms, including pandemic management, and how it helps the country's global status. So let's connect this to public diplomacy. My understanding of public diplomacy is that it is international actors or transnational actors, communication-based activities to support foreign policy goals. And for Korea, this has been a very important tool for the last decade. Korea officially introduced its public diplomacy policies in 2010, but there has been quick evolution. The budget has been increasing. The country has become more assertive in its public diplomacy policies. And COVID-19 just came at this time when the country was investing more and more in its public diplomacy, when it was becoming more assertive. And COVID-19 has been an opportune moment in a way that Korea wanted to use this for its public diplomacy. But then again, although it's been assertive, it's also been cautious because of two main reasons. One is that you cannot really do victory laps for two reasons. One, there is no victory until the pandemic is over, because today you may be doing well, tomorrow you may have some difficulties. Indeed, Korea was doing very well in 2020, but 2021 has not been as successful initially because of being late in vaccinations. But I think it's still, comparatively speaking, one of the most successful countries to manage the pandemic so far. But again, this is an ongoing pandemic, so Korea has been cautious not to do the victory laps early. And second, this is a tragedy going on, so you cannot really just show off for doing well. So you need to be cautious about how you do public diplomacy, because it's promotion to some extent. So for these two reasons, Korea has been cautious. And if I may add, public diplomacy also had another element which addressed the domestic public, because if you do well and if you show off, if you promote how you did well to the world, it's also showing your people, your public, that you have been doing well. So the government is doing well. So it might have also played some role in the domestic elections, in the general elections that we had in May 2020. So that's kind of a side goal, probably. That's not public diplomacy, but that's a parallel goal for doing public diplomacy. And if we look at the official documents, how the country evaluates its COVID-19 related public diplomacy, the official report suggests that Korea aims to consolidate Korea's image as a model for promoting democracy, leveraging its advanced information and communications technology, developed civil society, and acclaimed COVID-19 response principles manifested by transparency, openness, and democracy. So, as I suggested earlier, I'm not making this connection. This connection has already been made by the officials in both their speeches, in their quotes, as well as the official reports. Maybe we can move to the next slide. There is a delay here.
Yes.
So there has been two public diplomacy narratives for Korea. One of which is Korea promoted how successful it has been by showing numbers as well as sharing positive news coverage about the country. And second, promoting international solidarity and cooperation, especially through these two campaigns, Trust and the other one was Stay Strong. Stay Strong and Trust campaigns, hashtag campaigns, hybrid campaigns in a way, online and offline. So if we move to the second part of my paper and my talk about the trends in COVID-19 humanitarian aid, Korea has given nearly $500 million. This is only in 2020 because 2021 numbers are not released yet. So for this paper and for this talk, everything that I'll talk about right now is 2020 statistics. The country has given nearly $500 million. Indeed, actually, it gave a little bit more than that, but only this amount qualifies as ODA according to OECD standards. And it's given it to 120 countries, some of which received much more, some of which received only a little. And 36 million of this was given to multilateral initiatives. And if we look at the regions and the countries, East Asia, especially Southeast Asian countries, have received the most, and this is mainly due to the New Southern Policy. So if we look at here, by far, East Asia and Pacific countries have received the most, followed by Africa, and then other regions. And if we look at the countries, Philippines have received the most. And among these 10 countries, 9 of them are already designated as priority countries for Korea's international development cooperation, for Korea's aid, except for number 10, Uzbekistan, as far as I remember. The other 9 are priority countries, most of which are again then partners in New Southern Policy, mostly Southeast Asian countries. Sorry, there's been a delay in the slides. I need to see the numbers. Oh, sorry. Yes. And when we look at ODA trends, we tend to look at it in two ways. Is it for the recipient needs, or is it for the strategic interests of the donor? This is how most scholars look at the ODA distribution. And in terms of Korea's COVID-19 aid, COVID-19 severity, which is about recipient needs, has played an important role, as far as I can tell. And but GDP per capita, which is indicative of the needs of country in terms of its economy, has not played almost any role in Korea's aid distribution for COVID-19. When it comes to Korea's strategic interests, Korea's exports have some correlation. I cannot really talk about causation, but Korea's exports have some correlation with the country's COVID-19 aid, and also countries' foreign policy priorities, as I mentioned earlier, New Southern Policy and priority countries, which are kind of hubs, strategic hubs in their regions, especially in Southeast Asia, but also to some extent in South America and Central Asia. Central Asia is also, of course, related to New Northern Policy. So these are some of the scatter plots that shows the correlations. Again, this is a working paper, so I'm actually running the regressions. I had my earlier regressions, but I didn't want to bring them today because they're early, as I suggested. So these are just some early statistics that I can share. So when we look at cumulative COVID-19 cases, there is a positive correlation with the country's COVID-19 aid. And especially if we take out India, this would be even more positive because India is kind of an outlier. It has received only 7,000 USD despite its population and despite the severity of COVID-19 there, probably because they didn't really need it. So, but it's in the numbers. So it's an outlier. If I take it out, probably it would be even stronger. GDP per capita, as I said, did not play almost any role. It's all over the place, so it's quite flat. The correlation is quite flat. And exports, there is a positive correlation there. Again, if we take out India, probably this would be even stronger. We can move next. So this means the more Korea exports to a country, the more likely that they would receive COVID-19 humanitarian aid from Korea. Distance, again, the closer a country to Korea, the more likely that they would receive aid, regardless of all other potential factors. So again, suggesting the importance of new Southern policy countries, Southeast Asia. And this is, I think, my final graph on this section. Korea's COVID-19 aid is highly correlated with the country's total aid after I take out COVID-19 from it. So total non-COVID-19 aid in 2020. It's a very positive correlation. Again, India, as you can see at the very bottom, it's also an outlier here. So if we take it out, it would be even a stronger correlation there. So the trend is not specific to COVID-19. As I said, this is Korea's strategic foreign policy interests, and it's showing similar patterns, not only for COVID-19, but also for the country's general overall aid trends. And it's not only this nearly $500 million that Korea gave, but there has been also some symbolic aid. Korea gave nearly 3 million masks for Korean War veterans in participating countries, and half going to the US. This is a news value because it's emotional. Korea is kind of suggesting that it's paying back for what these people have done, and it's good public diplomacy. They are old people who participated in the war, so it's good public diplomacy to that end. And especially this was important. Today you can find masks everywhere, but in the early months of the pandemic, sending masks was a big deal, as you might remember. And now in this section, I'll be looking at how Korea did on the digital platform, Twitter, through its MOFA Korea Z account, the country's official public diplomacy account. This account has not been very active until recently. And when they tweeted, they mostly tweeted in Korean. So it wasn't really targeting an international audience. It wasn't really doing public diplomacy. But COVID-19 kind of catalyzed the account to move from Korean to exclusively English. There has been more activity. There has been new branding of the account. So it's not just public diplomacy account, but it's called Korea Z now. And in 2020 especially, there has been a COVID-19 focus in most of the tweets, but less so in 2021. I guess because Korea has been relatively more successful in 2020 compared to 2021. And among the tweets, 72% had an international cooperation focus. So previously, it was just sharing about Korea's culture, promoting Korea. But again, due to the nature of the pandemic, the international cooperation and solidarity has been the main focus. And I'll return to this on my discussion. And if we look at the frequent words, we would also see that international cooperation and solidarity has been the most important theme. So COVID-19 has been the most important, most frequent words, followed by world, global, and cooperation, for example, is among these words, together, future forum. So Korea has done also a lot of events, series related to COVID-19. And if we move to the next slide, I also have the binary word networks. And again, we see global innovation dialogue future, which is about the forum that Korea did related to post-pandemic kind of collaboration between countries. Stay strong, the campaign, and also post-COVID-19 response and overcoming COVID-19 has been among the important words. And as I said, this is not a new trend. This has been an ongoing trend that COVID-19 has only catalyzed. Enna Park, Ambassador Enna Park, who was a former public diplomacy ambassador, in a speech at University of Southern California and in later what became a chapter, book chapter, she suggested that Korea is now moving from public diplomacy 2.0 to public diplomacy 3.0. Public diplomacy 3.0 being going beyond promoting yourself, going beyond two-way symmetrical exchanges, which is 2.0 in her words, and considering providing for the world. So using public diplomacy for the global public good. And she suggested Korea is still at 2.0, but we want to move towards 3.0. And I think Korea has been at the right spot, what she called public diplomacy 3.0 during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I hope this focus continues, because it's really important that the international audiences recognizes Korea as an important authority in global governance if the country wants this global status. And of course, other policymakers in other countries recognizes the country as such. So it's difficult to achieve by only promoting yourself. So Korea needs to move towards 3.0 as the countries that it has been benchmarking, the middle powers, the usual suspects, Northern European countries as well as Australia, Canada. And when we look at how the country, so what happened after doing all this, right? Korea was invited to G7 as an observer. And indeed, Trump entertained the idea of inviting Korea to an enlarged G11 or G12. Indeed, most recently, as I quoted earlier, Moon Jae-in suggested that if G10 was to be created, we would need to be there. So it's a welcome development for Korea. We cannot necessarily say this is because of COVID-19, but we can possibly speculate that COVID-19 probably catalyzed this ongoing transformation, especially helping the country to be recognized more for what it has been doing. And I think the ASEAN focus has been very important. As I said, New Southern Policy focus has been there for aid especially. It's important because ASEAN is the most important ally, most important, not ally, but most important partner for Korea, especially considering the tensions China-US rivalry. ASEAN and ASEAN member countries and Korea have similar goals, most important of which is avoiding a great power rivalry between these two powers and enmeshing them in ASEAN-led organizations. So I think there it's not only public diplomacy, but the foreign policy focus on ASEAN, I think, should continue, and it's I think a welcome development to see this focus in Korea's COVID-19 humanitarian aid forming. And what to do next? Sorry, I just missed something that I wanted to share. So this has helped Korea, this all COVID-19 narrative, successful management and also promotion of it, helped Korea to at least find its voice in the global platforms, especially regarding global health governance. And voice is authority in global governance, especially if you consider world order to be multiplex, as Amitav Acharya suggests. This is important. Finding your voice means having a seat at the table, a seat at the important table. And Korea has been a member of G20, but it's invited to important global platforms, such as I said, G7, and also it's been one of the co-chairs and establishers or founders of groups of friends of solidarity for global health security at the UN, WHO, and UNESCO. So these are all recent developments that are important. And what next? So has it all been good? In the promotional sense, yes. But what needs to follow is more substance. So when it comes to aid, Korea is not necessarily seen as a traditional donor yet, but it is now a member of OECD DAC, and it needs to act more like traditional donors, especially the countries that it is benchmarking, the middle power countries, which means that it needs to do more for global burden sharing, which means the country needs to increase its ODA-GNI ratio, and this is accepted in almost all official documents. Indeed, under Im Yong-bak, there has been so much talk and also reports of suggesting that the country would increase its ODA-GNI ratio, which is around 0.14 right now, way below 0.32 of OECD average, OECD DAC average, way below 0.7 of UN recommendation. So it needs to do more there, and it needs to increase its anti-aid, and this is also recognized in official documents by the country, and I hope it's going to move there, so it would provide more substance for the country's status claims. And I think for the country's public diplomacy overall, COVID-19 has been an important catalyzer to move from 2.0 to 3.0, a public diplomacy 3.0, and I hope this momentum goes on and the country can move beyond promoting the country, because promoting your country just for the sake of visibility is for smaller countries, really. For an important and stronger country like Korea, I think it needs to have more layers. Of course, the country needs to promote itself, but it should be just one of the layers. And international cooperation focus, I think, should continue to back up the country's global status claims. I think that was my last slide. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to a lively discussion.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Ayhan. That was a fantastic presentation, and again, I encourage the audiences to go to keia.org to find his paper and also other works from the academic paper series. Also, I'd like to remind audiences on the YouTube channel that the chat function is open for questions. If you have any questions for Dr. Ayhan, please do insert it onto the platform. But as a moderator, I'd like to take some privileges and perhaps start off with some of the questions that I had. You mentioned that some of the aims of Korea's public diplomacy is to have a seat at the table. But at the same time, your paper mentioned that there were also explicit strategic goals, such as New Southern Policy that's aligning with, and also some commercial goals. For instance, you mentioned in your paper that the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy underscored potential benefits of highlighting Korea's pandemic response for its new bioindustry exports. So, what do you see as Korea's end goal in seeking a higher status? Is it strategic? Is it commercial? What do you see as Korea's objective?
I think this is a very important question. This question, I think, is pretty much the same, more or less, or this kind of dilemma is pretty much the same for most countries that are seeking status. Is status a good on its own, or is it instrumental? This is same for individuals as well. Do we want higher status in the society just for the sake of it, because we feel better of by having a higher status, that we can enter clubs, that we can enter certain platforms, we can be among high status people, or for the countries we can have a higher, we can have our seat at a higher table, at the adults table, kind of. Or is it instrumental? Because status brings you access, status brings you power to do other things. So if you have your voice there, it means that you can also shape the policies there by having a seat at the table. So yes, having a seat at the table feels good, but it also gives you access to agenda setting. It gives you access to maybe build confidence with other high status countries, or by showing your enemies or potential enemies that you are at the top table, so you're not to be messed with. So this is, I think, same for Korea. To some extent, yes, maybe we can say it's for the citizens and for the government to feel good about it. But I think mostly it's about instrumental for the country's security. So if, for example, think about Korea 50 years ago. Korea had to follow the US in most of its foreign policy decisions, but today it has more freedom. Indeed, this freedom has been pronounced a lot by the Korean ambassador to the United States recently. Korea does not really have to make a choice between the US and China when it's in the middle, because yes, US is our most important ally. He's been suggesting, yes, US is our most strategic military ally, but then again, China is our important trade partner. So we don't want to be in a position to choose between the two. Being able to say this suggests that Korea's status is higher than before. Even just you consider the US-Korea relationship, even within the alliance, having a higher status means having more voice, more authoritative voice within this alliance itself, rather than just being dominated by, United States with huge power asymmetry between the two. You can at least talk as equals. So I think that has something to do with status. Perfect. So in that sense, it's instrumental.
I have a follow-up to that, if I may. I couldn't help but notice, and I'm sure it's a bias from me reading your paper in the United States, where all the conversations around the Indo-Pacific is very much focused on the US-China rivalry. And in your paper, you mentioned that in certain cases, some influential voices in South Korea have underscored the quarantine, the K-quarantine, as a more of a liberal version of responsible public policy without, deferring to more authoritarian or more restrictive measures. And, I'm sure that's an American bias from my end, but it sounded very much like a response to how China has handled the pandemic. Is that something that the American audiences should pay attention to? And are there perhaps areas of alignment that you might recommend for perhaps US policymakers when they're approaching how Korea is presenting its public health, model?
Yes, I think it was pronounced most assertively by Korea Foundation President Egan, as kind of promoting or suggesting that Korea's model is liberal and open, as opposed to the Chinese model, which is more closed and to some extent authoritarian. It was his suggestion, but I think this is important in the sense that we are not only talking about a pandemic, but we are talking about resilience, which is becoming more and more important in the age that we live in. What about, for example, I talked about data before we come in. data security, cyber security, these kind of things could collapse a country because we rely more and more on e-government, for example. You can paralyze a country if you shut down their internet. Recently, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp were down for I don't know how long, but people were like didn't know what to do, right? So everybody was on Twitter. There were jokes like that. But what if the whole internet collapses in a country or in the world through cyber attacks, right? So these kind of things require resilience. So in these kind of situations, in these kind of crises, how do you deal with it? How does the government deal with it? In a more transparent way that also considers citizens' safety, or in a more state-centric way, which is more authoritarian. So does Korea provide a model? I think it's too early to say right now. But I think what Korea showed is that Korea has huge potential to that extent to maybe build a model. I don't think necessarily that Korea has this resilience model yet, because it also has its criticisms in terms of potential privacy violations that it has been addressing actually, trial and error, in a trial and error way. But I think Korea has shown its potential to be one of these potential models for resilience.
Perfect. Well, I have a related question to that, and I think I'm going to tie it to a question from our Q&A from an audience from the National University of Malaysia, which deals with whether or not South Korea should dig further into global health diplomacy, if that's kind of the direction that they want to go to. But I want to tie in whether you see more, I guess, lucrative areas for Korea to go into. Like, what's next for Korea's public diplomacy? Is it health? Is it digital security, as you mentioned? What are some other areas of governance that you feel as though has advantages for Korea, and is public global health diplomacy that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because most of the middle powers that I've been mentioning in my paper and in this talk, most of these middle powers and small states, especially in North Europe, Scandinavia, they have been doing what's so-called a niche diplomacy. So they find their niche, or you can also talk about Singapore, small countries. They find their niche and they excel at it. Peace, for example, for Norway, or to some extent climate action for Sweden, partnering with NGOs, civil society for Canada, things like that. So these countries do very well in one issue area and not so much in other issues. They're not as visible in other global governance issue areas. Korea has not really done that yet. Korea has been, under Im Yong-bak, we can say green growth was one of these fields that Korea promoted but not really excelled at. I think in a previous article, actually, I talk about this, and I suggest that Korea is doing this not in a niche way, but in a more general way. Korea is trying to excel at all kinds of global governance issue areas that do not necessarily require contention, like contentious issues or military. Indeed, military also is included for peacekeeping operations, but I mean more peaceful issue areas that require global collaboration between states and also transnational actors. So I cannot really suggest a specific issue area. I don't know if global health governance would be one, but it's a good idea to find the countries at least a few niches that it can definitely excel at, so that it would be more visible. It would have some visibility. But so, Korea is so big that it cannot really ignore other issue areas. Because some small countries, very small states, they really excel at one or two issue areas, and they are almost non-visible in other issue areas. So Korea does not have this luxury, because it's so big that it needs to be among the top in almost all global issue areas. But there could be a few. Recently, the Korean government, as you have suggested, have been investing in bioindustry, for example, global health, vaccines, green growth again, climate. So these issue areas may be some of these important niches that Korea can be better at.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to move on to other questions in the Q&A. I have a question from Jenna Gibson, who is a very familiar name, scholar at the University of Chicago. She actually has a question that's very relevant to, I guess, in the next 2 months, which is, South Korea has a presidential election coming up in March of this year. There's been a lot of political discord in Korea around the campaigns. Do you think this will potentially distract from Korea's ability to engage in global public diplomacy?
I think Korea's public diplomacy for the last decade, as I said, Korea's public diplomacy is very novice, very recent. But for the last decade, it's been quite bipartisan. So every president, every administration has been building on the previous work. I mean, the names change, the focus slightly changes, institutions sometimes change, but the overall focus, I think, has been building on, except for one thing, except what's so-called the policy public diplomacy. So recently, in 2016, there was this 5-year plan for the new administration. Actually, it was created under Park Geun-hye administration, but it was implemented, of course, by Moon Jae-in administration because it was for 2017 to 2021. They established or they introduced 3 different kinds of public diplomacy. One is cultural public diplomacy, one is so-called policy public diplomacy, and the third is kind of knowledge or intellectual public diplomacy. Policy public diplomacy, so cultural public diplomacy is pretty much the same across all the administrations. But for the first time, since this is also a recent development, policy public diplomacy has the potential to be partisan. Because I also deal with this in another upcoming chapter for Korea's public diplomacy in the United States. The focus of Korea's public diplomacy, especially policy public diplomacy in the United States, has been North Korea or inter-Korean relations, especially the peace process that Moon Jae-in so much emphasizes, President Moon Jae-in emphasizes. And it is a partisan policy because there is so much backlash from the conservative Korean American community on Twitter and on offline platforms. And if the administration changes to the conservatives, I don't think they would follow up. Indeed, they may be undoing what the previous administration, the Moon Jae-in administration, has been doing on that end. But other than this contentious inter-Korean focused policy public diplomacy, especially in the United States, overall, I think there won't be anything partisan about it. So the focus, I mean, COVID-19 focus kind of faded away by the end of 2020. I don't know if it will continue, but one way or another, I think the new administration, regardless of which aisle they're from, I think they'll continue to build on what the other administrations have been doing, except that North Korea part.
Gosh, it's always the problem in North Korea. Sarah Marshall from American University asked a very interesting question regarding the correlation that you drew between South Korea's export relationship and the amount of COVID-19 assistance that that country received. Why might that be? I'm trying to perhaps tease out a causation here. Is it because of existing networks, or do you feel as though it's because of perhaps commercial interests that Korea has in that country?
This is not just Korea. I mean, if you look at the US also, similar research on US aid trends, many other donors' aid trends, you would find similar correlations. Indeed, maybe you can, to some extent, talk about causation as well. It's mainly about commercial interests. Because aid traditionally does not really go to the most needy places. It goes to where the countries have their strategic interests in. For example, UK aid goes to countries like Brazil. Or if you look at, for example, US aid per capita, Israel receives the most. I don't know the latest figures, but I think it would be pretty much like that. The last time I checked, I think it was 2019, and it was around 367 USD per person. Israel, I mean, it's not a needy country, and it's 100% military aid, but still. And Palestine, on the other end, they've been receiving also similar amount in humanitarian aid, maybe just to match kind of balance between the two. But if you look at, for example, countries like Bangladesh, Mali, Kenya, which may be needing more aid, which definitely need more aid, they've been receiving, if I remember correctly, less than $10 or around $20 per person. So this is a trend that's not unique to Korea. Most countries, indeed, there is. I mean, foreign policy, including aid, has to be strategic. It cannot be unstrategic. But the main question is about short-term interests or long-term interests. This is a dilemma for all countries, also for China. Short-term interests are often advocated by ministries of economy, ministries of finance. They want returns on their aid. So we give aid. Do we get projects in this country? Do we have commercial interests in this country? When do we get returns on our kind of investment through this aid? But Ministry of Foreign Affairs in most countries would be interested in long-term, building friendships, building partnerships with these countries. Yes, if we become good friends, maybe they will side with us when we need them, right? Especially for countries that run for leadership in regions or that need the help of other countries. So that's the same, I think, for pretty much all countries. So Korea is not unique to that end. But what I meant by export was, yes, commercial interests.
Okay. Well, I think I will finish off the discussion with one last question for you, Dr. Ayhan, which is, as a Koreanist, and perhaps this is, again, a bias from having studied Korea, which is that Korea has so much to offer in terms of governance models like industrialization, digitization, reforestation, and yet I can't help but notice that COVID-19 response has really been the big coming out moment for Korea. And I'm curious, is it that this is the culmination of long-term, infrastructure construction by Korea to have the capacity to promote itself? Or is it that Korea is still very much reliant on these quite idiosyncratic crises to promote itself? What do you see as kind of the reason why COVID-19 was such a big opportunity for Korea?
I think there are two reasons. One is that Korea was kind of lucky in a not very good way because it was hit by MERS before. So all the infrastructure that the Korea benefited in the early, especially months of COVID-19, was built during this MERS pandemic. All the test centers and hand sanitizers, masks. And masks have been going around because of air pollution anyways. So there has been increase in production of masks anyways. So it's been kind of more prepared compared to most other countries because of this unfortunate MERS pandemic or endemic before. But the other thing is that Korea is really good at adapting and being resilient. So the changes, responses are relatively quick. So I think this building the infrastructure, coming up with new innovations like drive-through testing, for example, apps, QR codes and everything. I think Korea has been very great at this innovation and adapting to changes and understanding and interpreting what is going on relatively faster than most countries. And I think these two reasons, one is kind of luck, but also you may have had this pandemic and still not have built this infrastructure. So I think it was a kind of a good call to have built this infrastructure before, which may be needed for more pandemics, hopefully not, but which potentially may come. That and also adaptation and innovation, I think.
Perfect. Well, with that, I would like to thank you, Dr. Ayhan, for this wonderful conversation. I learned a lot. And I'd like to thank you, audience, for participating and joining us today. This discussion was part of KAI's academic paper series, and we will bring you more insights on Korea next time. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe, and click on the bell button to stay up to date with all of KAI's YouTube content. And you can also find Dr. Ayhan and other academic paper series reports from leading Korea scholars at keia.org in the publications page under the Analysis tab. Thank you again, and see you soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.